Hello everyone and welcome back to Global Chess. In today's video, I'll be giving you a whistle-stop recap of my round 1 from the 2023 Daily Chess Championships on chess.com. So in case you're not aware, let me just give you a quick recap and rundown of what the Daily Chess Championships actually is. So as you can see here, 35,000 competitors, and on the 18th of February, the day I'm recording, there are about 3,500 left. So around 90% of people are already out of the tournament and round 1 hasn't even finished yet. This tournament started on the 1st of January, 1 day per move and no vacation. So it's pretty quick turnover, especially if you're not usually logging in every day. Average rating 948, so pretty low. My current rating is about 2100 in daily chess, so I was expected to make it through to round 2, but we'll see what happens. And at the moment, there are 59 games remaining out of around 385,000 in total, so it's nearly time for round 2. So, without further ado, let's see how I did in round 1. And if you like our videos, then please remember to give us a like or a subscribe. We really appreciate it. We're just a new channel trying to build up as much of a fan base as we possibly can. So if you like what you see, then please show some appreciation. Thank you. I was placed in group number 68 in this tournament, which, based on the fact that I'm the 68th seed out of the 35,000. And then it was placed with 11 other players. The second highest seed was rated 1358, so around 700 points rating difference between me and the second highest seed. And then it just went down from there, really, all the way down to 162 rating for the lowest rated person. So quite a big range of ratings there, which led to some one-sided games, but it was actually much more competitive than I was expecting it to be. So yeah, I hope you enjoy having a look at some of these games. So let's move on to the games themselves. So I was expecting to show you 22 games in this recap, 11 opponents, black and white. But 6 of my opponents actually timed out within the first 2 or 3 days. So instead of 22 games to show you, it's just the 10. So anyway, let's get started. So my first opponent, you can see at the top there, username Nifome. I'm not sure, and the flag that's there is actually incorrect. He wasn't Swedish. He's actually an Irish player, a fellow Irish player, and he messaged me during the tournament actually to say that it was an honor to play against the 47th ranked player in Ireland in rapid play, which I wasn't aware of beforehand, but it was still a very nice message. So thank you for that. So let's have a look at the first game then. I was playing black, so my opponent started with e4, pretty standard, and we went into a Vienna. Not an opening I know particularly well, but thankfully in daily chess we get the use of the openings book, which helps quite a lot. If this was a rapid or blitz game, might not have gone so well. But with the openings book, I knew the best move here, d5. Maybe from watching Gotham's videos, we might already know that. So my opponent plays the right move. He took on e5, and I took on e4. He takes my knight, which apparently isn't the best move. Apparently, you're meant to play knight f3 there. And then we get this position where the one of our pawns has gone into enemy territory by themselves. They both look a bit isolated, but I think mine is a little bit better than his. But we'll see what happens. D4, and then en passant, obviously, has to be done. And then my opponent took back with the pawn, which seems like a bit of a mistake already. As you can see from the eval bar, it's gone to -2 to me already just from this move. Um, the reason for that, because if my opponent takes with the queen or bishop, he's absolutely fine. Because when my opponent takes with the pawn, this c pawn that's now a d pawn is a little bit backwards, and his queen no longer has an open file. His bishop is blocked in. It's a few different little things are wrong with that move, and that's why it's -2 to me already. So I develop my knight, and so does he. Bishop g4, pin the knight to the queen. Seems like a pretty obvious thing to do in the opening. And my opponent made another mistake early on, queen e2. blocking the bishop on f1 in, and generally not really serving any purpose because the knight is still pinned to the queen. And yeah, I assume maybe my opponent was thinking about playing e6, but that can't be done at the moment, so I'm not really sure what the purpose of this move was. So I played knight d4, which gets the exclamation mark there from chess.com, which is very nice. We're out of opening book at this moment, so you know I can take my own credit for that. It's not the computer. And then my opponent goes back to d1. I guess recognizing that moving to e2 wasn't such a good idea. Um, and he just got attacked by the knight, and it couldn't be taken because of the pin. So swap off pieces, queen h4 check. So probably one of the biggest weaknesses with the Vienna moving that f pawn forward immediately is that this queen h4 idea is always on the table at some stage, and especially with how it's happened in this game, there's no knight or bishop there to block this check, so the king has to move again. Um, having your king moving to the center of the board on move 12 generally isn't a good idea. So here we go again, queen f2 check, and the king keeps running. Knight b5 check, and my opponent actually resigned here. So not the best game from my opponent in game number one, but thankfully in game number two was very different. It was a much tighter game, and let's have a look at that one now. So game two. So I started off at e4, and my opponent played a Sicilian. Pretty standard stuff. I play an open Sicilian, and then we get this position early on with my queen in the center of the board. Probably not the best idea already from black, because I've got my queen, the strongest piece, in the middle of the board, and most importantly, it can't be attacked, can't be driven out of there. If my opponent could put a knight on c6, then it's probably not great to have the queen on d4. But now the queen just has free reign and can do whatever she wants, so that's why it's already +1 to me. We have some standard developing moves, and now my opponent does attack me. As you can see, the engine doesn't actually like it. Um, I imagine the reason for that is because this pawn here is now a backward pawn, and is going to be the whole game is now going to be focused on can my opponent actually keep hold of it with his queen, bishop, potentially king as well, and I'll try and attack it and see if I can grab it at some stage. So I gave my opponent a check in between, and then we swapped off our pieces, and now I moved my queen out of the attack. So 9 moves in, plus 1.8 so far, but no material advantage, and both kings relatively safe to start with, but just positionally I'm a little bit better because of that backward pawn on d6. We have some more developing moves, and my opponent gets his bishop and knight out, and I castle queenside because I felt like I need to, because if I castle queenside, it looks like my opponent's going to go to the king side. We're going to have a bit more of an imbalanced game, and given the rating difference, I guess that's what I'm probably looking for to happen. So my opponent played rook d8, kind of guarding that pawn again, and I slide the king over to b1 because whenever you castle queenside, it's almost mandatory to play king b1 really, because you don't want any sort of discovered checks on this diagonal to happen, and you need to defend the pawn on a2, which can become a bit of a liability when you castle queenside. So my opponent castles as well, and then I played f4, which, as you can see, the computer is not a fan of. Um, Not exactly sure why. I think probably because it weakens up g4, um, and maybe this pawn isn't particularly good. So now that I'm going to giving him a way out to swap off this pawn, which will open up the e file potentially for him as well. I think that's why. But it still puts me as better. But it said that I could have done some better options there. It recommended f3 and then g4, h4, some sort of like English attack sort of moves. Fair enough. I wasn't really thinking about that, but Okay, so f4 my opponent took, which is good, and then I took it back. So as you can see now, I have queen, bishop, and rook all attacking this pawn on d6, but my opponent's guarding it 3 times. So at the moment it's fine, but I'm still going to try and keep piling that pressure on that pawn. h6, my opponent's going to probably try and drive my bishop out of there sometime soon. h3, just intended to stop my opponent coming to g4 really, or maybe just trying to play g4 myself quite soon. Apologies. My opponent puts his rook on the open file. At this point in the game, I was kind of struggling to know what to do. Equal material. Clearly, according to the computer, I'm better, but how do I win it? I wasn't really sure. Because I feel like that's my weakness at this point. I'm a good player, around 1900, 2000, 2100, but trying to actually win these sort of games when they're very equal and steady. Sometimes I struggle to break through, so that's why sometimes in these positions I kind of get a bit stuck, not sure what the plan is. So the computer there was recommending rook h to f1 and just generally starting a kingside attack with the pawns, the rook, the queen on the king side. But I guess I was thinking a bit more short term, just to play queen e3, getting like a bit of a battery on this pawn, or getting my queen attacking this pawn. So going a bit too short term probably. Anyways, my opponent played d5, which, as you can see, is a blunder according to the computer, because basically it just loses a pawn, which he didn't need to do, but that pawn was always under pressure right from the start. So, it's understandable. And then rook takes d5, and my opponent can't take because, he might have been thinking about this sort of thing, but, the bishop is in the way of this taking my queen, so it doesn't quite work, unfortunately. So after I took the pawn, queen c8, and I doubled rooks because that's just what you do on an open file, really. Bishop f6, I assume was trying to just open up this file to attack my queen at some stage. And then I thought that swapping rooks would be a good idea now that I'm actually a pawn up, get the pieces off, but computer didn't like it. Computer wanted what did the computer want? Bishop d6, queen f3. Queen f3 would have been, to set up, taking this pawn and then grabbing the bishop on f6, winning another pawn. But I thought swapping the pieces off can't be a bad idea when I'm winning. So, and then I try to set up kind of like the queen f3 idea, rook f1, trying to set up attack on this bishop potentially. And then once again, I'm still not really sure what to do to actually try and win the game. So I played e5, driving the bishop out of there. And then my opponent made a mistake. He went to g5, which simply loses a pawn after exchanging and then taking the pawns. Now we're down to a queen and rook and a few pawns each, but I've got 2 extra pawns. So if we just swap off material, I'm going to win the king and pawn ending. So that's the plan, really. Just get the material off. But easier said than done, especially when my opponent clearly does not want to do that. So I played a3, which is always a good idea in these endgames, just to stop any back rank checkmates. And then we danced around a little bit. I gave away the pawn, not intentionally, but I thought I wasn't able to defend it. Um, the engine sees a way of defending it, I think, with rook e1 and then queen g3. But I didn't really fancy that, so I just tried to put my queen on a bit more of a better square. But it gives away the pawn. I try and set up a few mating threats. Um, a lot of short-term ideas though. As the engine still says it's 1 plus 1.2, 1.3 for me, but it's quite easily defendable, all of these little threats that I have. I keep dancing around a little bit, and at this point on move 31, my opponent actually timed out. He didn't make his move within the 24 hours, and so I got the win, which I was very thankful for because I'm quite higher rated, but if this game had actually finished, it might well have been a draw. So he played really well. So kudos to him. But yeah, I think the plan after this would have been to bring my rook over to the king side, um, or generally just trying to get and swap off the rooks if possible, or the queens even better. But easier said than done. So I'm happy with that lucky escape there in game number two. So my next opponent was Alan Williams, 7547, rated 1314. So a bit of a step up in quality here. So the game starts out with a French, the E5 French, which is the Steinitz attack. Not something you see very often, and I wasn't really sure what to play, but I just went with the opening book, which suggested D6. Um, just followed the theory for this part of the game. Apparently, Bishop B5 wasn't the right move. He was meant to take the pawn there, but as I said, I'm not particularly familiar with this variation of the French. So I just played some standard developing moves. Apparently d4 is a mistake because in this position I could actually take the pawn here. And whatever my opponent does, if he takes the knight, I can grab the bishop. Or, sorry about the lag there. Or if the opponent grabs the bishop, I can take it back with the knight and I've won a pawn. I did see this later on, but at this point I didn't actually see that. So after d4, I tried something different. Not my usual style of play whatsoever, but I played f5. Which weakens this diagonal at the king quite a bit, but I thought it was worth it to actually just get some attacking play going against this slightly unique e5 push so early. We'll see how it works out. So my opponent played bishop f4. Apparently he was meant to take the pawn and just kind of generally leave these two pawns weak and backward, but thankfully he didn't do that. So then in this position, I did actually take the pawn now, and apparently it was a mistake, as usual. You know, mistiming the when to play the tactic, and we'll see why. Because I do still win the pawn, as we can see, but it just becomes a bit tricky. Like this pawn is isolated and backward, and not defended by anything. So despite being a pawn up, I have no development here whatsoever. This pawn is terrible, and my king is quite open, so it wasn't worth it. And I just spend the next 10 or 15 moves trying to get out of trouble, basically. My opponent castles. I play knight c5 because I wasn't sure what else to play, really. It was the best move, apparently, because I thought that if I didn't play knight c5, my opponent is just going to attack this pawn, maybe with the rook, or with the queen, or knight g5, or just so many different moves could attack that pawn, and then I'm just in big trouble if that pawn falls and the e file is open. So I played knight c5 just to guard the pawn and hopefully get a queen trade, which does happen. And I give the pawn on c7 back, but that's absolutely fine. I'll take it if I can actually get out of this lock that I'm in. Drive his bishop back, and now put the knight onto e4, onto that lovely little outpost there. My opponent played c3 because I was attacking the pawn on c2, and now knight f6. And now look at these knights just defending each other, which is exactly what you want your knights to be doing. And I also played it this way around because if my opponent tries to play knight g5, then I can still defend this pawn if I need to. And also the g7 pawn is defended by the bishop. There was a lot of pawns potentially hanging for me early on, but I managed to hold on to them. So my opponent wants to trade knights, which I'm fine with, really, because I'm sending his knight backwards, so it can't come to g5 anymore. Bishop e7. Finally, all my pieces developed. Only took 15 moves, but I got there. My opponent puts the knight back on f3, which is where it wants to be, really, and I'm finally castled. So I finally got pretty much what I've wanted. I'm developed, I'm castled. Now I just need to figure out how to defend this pawn. But it's not attacked right now, so that's fine. But it's going to be quite soon, I'm sure. There we go. Knight d4 and king f7. So eval is dead equal after 17 moves, which is okay, but it's round one. I'm the top seed, um, and there's a couple of strong competitors in this group with me, so I can't really afford a draw. So I need to figure out how to win this game. Thankfully, my opponent just went backwards to knight back to f3. Maybe he wasn't sure what else to do. Probably should have just put his rooks in the middle on e1 and d1. But anyway, so I played h6, stopping him from coming to g5, and going to probably play g5 at some point. Well, I should have done. I didn't, but I probably should be doing that. And now my opponent does play rook d1, and now I put my rook on the open file as well. And then my opponent makes quite a clear mistake to move off the open d file. When rooks are facing each other like that, uh, whoever blinks first is usually the one that's made the mistake. Because I wasn't really threatening anything, there was no real need to move it away, but he has, and now the d file is mine, which is what I wanted. I played rook d5. Engine is not happy. Said I should have played knight e4, which makes sense. Put it on the outpost. Uh, and my opponent played c4, trying to drive my rook away. But I'm fine with that really, because now this c4 pawn is a bit of a weakness. Really, it's not defended by its buddy anymore. Rook a5, attacking his pawn, and he defends it. And now I want to try and get that knight into the game. Apparently, I should have went this way to e4 instead, which in retrospect makes sense. But I just wanted to get rid of that bishop because it's such a pain in my position now. He goes back, e5. At this point, I thought that I was doing really well. I thought I was finally turning the screw a little bit. Engine, obviously doesn't agree. Always ruins all of the best laid plans. Makes you look like an idiot. But um, yeah, I don't know. I was quite happy with this now that I've finally got all my pawns marching forward and it's not stuck on e6 anymore. He goes back. Now I double up on that c pawn, and now we have the blunder finally. 25 moves, but I'm finally ahead. This pawn is just hanging now on c4. What he was supposed to do, which was not that easy of an idea to find, was rook cd1. Yeah, so he could have played the rook to d1 and then forcing my knight away somewhere, let's say here, and then he'll be grabbing this pawn instead. But not that easy to find. So now I'm a pawn up, and my opponent helps with finishing the game off basically because he swaps rooks. And when you're in an endgame, and you're winning, swapping one pair of rooks is exactly what you want. Um, I put my bishop on f6, got a bit more scope here, and I'm going to play e4 quite soon. And there it is. And my opponent tries to danger levels me by playing b3, but it doesn't actually work because now I can play rook c2, and now his knight and his bishop are attacked. If the knight moves, the bishop's gone. If he moves the bishop, the knight's gone. So now I'm a pawn and a piece up. Sorry, just a piece up, but that's enough. And then I start to finish the game off pretty well, I think. Attack that pawn on b3, grab the a4 pawn. Lots of different moves happening, but I'm gradually just advancing that a pawn, and he's not stopping it. This is his last chance to stop it. He could play rook a6, and that would stop it momentarily. But he doesn't. He grabs the pawn instead, and now I'm going to get a queen, and he has to give up his rook. And now it's just a case of how and when do I mate. Rook and bishop checkmate. Not the easiest, so I decided to bring my king instead. We swap off a few of the pawns just to try and get them out of the way. And now it's just a case of finishing it off and try not to stalemate. According to the computer, it's mate in 6. Let's see what happens. King g2, rook f2, king h1, and it's not going to be stalemate because the g1 square is available. Discover check, king h1, and rook f1 checkmate. So that's game number 1 against Alan Williams. Let's have a look at game number 2. The second game was a little bit easier, thankfully. My opponent still played well, but I didn't get myself into so much of a pickle as I did last time. So anyway, the game starts with a London. I don't usually play d4, but in round one, trying to experiment with a few things. So we have standard London. I'm sure most people are quite familiar with how it works at this point. Move the bishop back to g3. I'm not really a fan of taking that bishop on d6. And knight bd2. And then we swap bishops. And then we get to this, pretty standard London position. Often this pawn will be on c3, but apart from that, I'm sure this position has happened millions of times before. Then my first mistake happens here though on move 9, knight g5, because that knight was doing pretty well on e4. Didn't really need to move, and now yeah, he's just aided me by moving out of there. So I swapped the bishops off, and now his pawn is double pawns, and now his d5 pawn is a little bit weak, and so is the f5 pawn. So I play c4. It looks a bit like a queen's gambit now. The position just looks really nice for me, with my two knights connected. Queen's gambit position, knight guarding the pawn, and my queen having a lot of scope to come to b3 or c2 at some point. So yeah, I was pretty happy here, even if the engine just says plus point 0.5, but I thought it was pretty good. So then my opponent played c6, which is a mistake. It loses a pawn after swapping the knights, and then queen b3. That b7 pawn or the d5 pawn, whichever, is going to be lost no matter what. My opponent played b6, swap pawns, and then queen takes d5. So queen's in the center of the board, can't be attacked. That's exactly what we want. And his rook on a8 is hanging. So how is he going to stop that? So he plays the only move, which is knight a6. But his knight is kind of in limbo because I move my queen back to c4, and then the only square he can go to is where it came from on b8. I wasn't sure at this stage what to do because I can keep him in this kind of paralysis, but I wasn't sure how to capitalize fully on it. So I repeat the moves again and then play queen b7 because I thought that if I can get his knight to move into b4, I can play a3, knight c2, rook c1, and somehow I'll trap his knight. I wasn't sure. I wasn't able to work it out, but we'll see what happens. So he does play knight b4. I played knight f3 to attack his queen. Apparently, I should have played a3 first. But I thought if I did it that way, that let's have a look. If I did it that way, knight c2, rook c1, I thought my opponent could take the pawn on d4. I don't know if I was. Let's see what the engine says if I was right with that or not. Uh, yeah, so apparently I was right with that. What was different? What should I have played? Let's have a look. Mm, rook a d1 or knight f3 first. Okay, I guess I could have just left it there and attacked it after a few moves. Yeah, okay, fair enough. So anyway, back to what happened in the game. So I played knight f3, not the best way. He moves it back to queen back to f6. So then what I was afraid of with this grabbing the knight on a diagonal is no longer an issue. So now I played knight e5, threatening knight d7 fork, and also threatening a3 as well. My opponent played a5, just defending his knight, but I guess he maybe didn't see the fork, I'm not sure. Attacks my queen, and then now the knight fork comes in. So it's plus 5 for me now. Feeling pretty confident now about winning the game. So I've won an exchange and a pawn. So now it's just a case of how to win. So I grab the pawn on f5 and on h7 and on g7. So now, yeah, it's a case of finding the mate. And the key to that probably is trying to get those rooks a bit more active on the c file. So firstly, I pin the knight, and then I get the queens off, which is exactly what I want. And now the rooks come into play. So I'm a rook and 3 pawns up. So it's a case of either checkmating him or promoting the pawns. And usually I try to promote the pawns, but in this case I actually managed to get the checkmate. So we had rook c6, grab a pawn, another pawn, and I was going to try and promote that G pawn, but then my opponent does kind of move himself into trouble. So I checked him on D1 and then on C6, and then he comes forward. So now it's mate in 7, apparently. I played rook D5, and then my opponent moved to G4, which means that next move, rook B4, checkmate, game over. So that's 4 from 4, plus the ones that I've won already from timeout. So it's 16 out of 16 and 6 games to go. Let's see what happens. So next up was actually the highest rated person in the group, other than myself, from Catalonia, Sans or Sanson. I'm not sure of the pronunciation. Apologies for that if it's wrong. But yeah, I was braced for a tough game. So let's see what happens. So my opponent played D4. So I don't think we've seen that so far today. Yeah. So I played E6. That's my usual go-to against D4 because it's not that common. So I'm hoping that kind of confuses people a bit. It's going to lead to a Queen's Gambit decline position probably at some point anyway, but different move order kind of shakes things up a little bit. So that's what happens. Queen's Gambit declined, and my opponent takes the pawn on D5, and I play C6, just trying to maybe allow my queen to be a bit more active on B6. I think we're following the opening book here at this point, so if there's any strange moves like knight A6, then I can put it down to the openings book. I didn't actually know that myself. I'm trying to reroute that knight from C7 maybe to E6 or B5, depending on what becomes available. Apologies, I'm not sure why the eval bar wasn't working there. So after pretty much 10 moves, I'm slightly ahead, but my opponent's played pretty well so far. The opening theory from both of us here, I think, and yeah, it's pretty equal. So let's see what happens. Bishop D6, swap the bishops, and then bishop D3, setting up a kind of battery on H7, but not that effective right now when the knight's guarding it. Knight E6, trying to grab that pawn on D4, which has been a little bit weak for a while now. After swapping the knight off on F3, this pawn is a bit isolated, and my opponent chooses not to defend it, which is fine right now because he's my knight can't move because of the pin to the king. But after I castle, now it can move at any point. So I thought my opponent was probably going to defend the pawn with Queen E3, seeing as that's the only way he can. But he castled, so now I can grab the pawn. So now I'm a pawn up, which is generally how I like to play anyway. Grabbing one pawn is often what all you need really. If you're a pawn up, you can get to an end game and win. That's how I like to play it anyway. I know other people probably prefer a bit more of a flamboyant approach, but I'm perfectly happy with that. So with Queen E3, attacking the knight, and I go back, and my opponent goes back because if he didn't, D4 was coming next move, and his horse would be gone. So with Queen D2, then I move the rook to the open file, and we swap rooks, which benefits me a little bit too. Now the E file is mine. I thought my opponent would play rook E1, but he just moves the knight back to E2 instead, trying to get it to F4 or D4, I suppose, which also makes sense. The only problem with it is next move knight B3, and it's a fork, so he's going to lose his rook for the knight, and his queen's in the corner. So now material. Let's have a look. I'm an exchange and a pawn up, and we're in an endgame. So yeah, it's just a case of trying to win the game, and I'm going to try and do that by pushing the C and D pawns forward. Just keep pushing these, especially with this D pawn being a pass pawn. If I can get that to the end, then that's it really. So C5 and C4 and D4, and then my opponent plays knight E4, which makes sense, but I'm happy with that because the more pieces come off, the better really for me. And D3, and now his bishop is on the wrong side. Ideally, he needs his bishop probably to be over here or here to actually stop the pawns. But coming from the other side is not going to be very helpful, and I can even maybe exchange, just sacrifice the rook. I'm not going to say it like Gotham does, uh, to try and just promote the pawn. So my opponent takes the pawn on b7, That's okay because I can keep pushing the pawn, and my opponent resigned here because no matter what he does, he can stop it with the queen, but then rook e1, and I'm going to promote, or he loses the queen. His bishop needs to be on a4, really, but it can't get there. Sorry, bad arrow. Needs to be on a4 to stop here, but it can't get there anymore. So yeah, it's game over. Let's have a look at the second game. So in the second game against my opponent from Catalonia, I played d4 again, still experimenting, and we had a like a Catalan, but not quite. According to the engine, it's the Sheeran variation. I'm not too sure myself of the exact difference. But anyway, I did a fianchetto on the king side and I played d4. So to me, it looks like a Catalan. But if someone can tell me why it's not, then please do. Um, I castled, so I'm kind of just setting up a solid, like a King's Indian almost, but with white. The only difference maybe this pawn will be on d3, not d4 in the King's Indian. And we have e6, and now the Queen's Gambit slash Catalan position, I think. Um, I exchange the pawn. We're just following the opening book here again, so I can't explain all of these moves, but um, we're allowed to use the openings book for some reason, so I'll take it. Knight c3, and then we swap off the knights, sorry. And so after 10 moves, um, pretty equal. This bishop is a bit of a pain, stopping my rook from coming to b1, but I might be able to rectify that soon with e4. And then if I get to play e4, I'm pretty happy because the whole center is mine pretty much with e4, d4, and c3. So let's see if my opponent will stop that. He didn't. He castled, which you know, castling nearly always makes sense, but here it doesn't because he needed to stop e4. That was what I was looking for. So the engine said he should have played bishop e4. Sorry, instead of castling, putting his bishop there so I can't put my pawn there, and I would have played knight d2, and then the bishops get swapped off. But this is a much slower version for me of developing, which is why it would be better. But he castled, so I played e4, and now the bishop has to go somewhere else. It goes to g4. Um, sorry. So then I played a4, which apparently wasn't right. My plan with a4 was, let's say, I'm just going to make a move with king h8 and then play bishop a3. I feel like it's one of those things from watching too many videos online of grandmasters who try and play something clever, like put the bishop behind the pawn and then swap them off, and then you've got rid of that bishop indirectly because you moved the pawn forward so the rook was defending it. But I feel like maybe I should leave that to the grandmasters because clearly it's not the right idea. So anyway, after in the actual game, I played a4 and my opponent played a6, which is a mistake. So clearly, me playing badly rubbed off on my opponent. Then I played bishop a3, which wasn't the right idea, as we said. And now my rook ends up on a3, which I was happy about, but I guess I didn't see the continuation, which knight a5, and then the knight's coming to c4, and that's just a bit of a pain. I didn't see that. I stop it, but now my rook just gets attacked anyway, and I drop back. I went to a2 because I thought maybe doubling the rooks here or on the b file might be happening at some point. But obviously the engine doesn't like it, but what's new? c5, good move. My opponent he's playing really well at the moment. He's really brought it back to parity right now, and I wasn't really sure how I was going to win this game here. Uh, him playing c4 though, probably not right. I thought he was going to take the pawn on d4. He pushes it on. Well, I see why, because he wants to put his knight on b3 and have an allowed post there, which he will. But I think he's just maybe weakened the pawn a bit too much by pushing it on like that. So I move the queen out of the attack. He plays b5 to defend the pawn. But now this a file is open. I know we both got rooks here, but This knight is going to be a liability now, and I'm going to just double up behind it. Maybe get the queen over there at some point as well. And yeah, because I have the move first. If it was his move, he could double up rooks, but now it's my move, and yeah, I'm going to have the advantage here. This A file is going to be mine. So he moves his queen over to defend the knight, and I'm trying to get my queen involved. Apparently not in the right way. It says I should have went to E3 and um, maybe try and swap the queen off there, or play E5, which makes sense to have like the connected three pawns just like that. But I wasn't really thinking about that. I was just thinking about his knight and how to grab it really. He played F6, Ben Feingold's favourite, and definitely not the engine's favourite in this case. It actually went from +1 to plus either 3 or 4, depending on what Stockfish thinks right now. Because it says I should play E5, and then when I play E5, which has opened up this diagonal, and yeah, that's going to cause him some problems long term. So that was a mistake. I didn't actually play E5 though. What did I play? I played H3, driving his bishop away back to H5, and I played G4, and now his bishop's gone all the way back, which I was pretty happy about. And now I play E5, opening the diagonal, but apparently I should have played E5 sooner, but okay, whatever. And then F5, and now I'm going to win that pawn. I think maybe my opponent could have defended the pawn potentially, maybe not. Maybe it just wasn't possible. I guess the rook's attacked, so he had to move it. So yeah. So I win a pawn. So it's taken a while, but now on move 27, I'm finally a pawn up, and my knight is in enemy territory, and it's +6. So it looks like I'm finally turning the screw. So my opponent decides to go for my king. Now that the G file is open, something could happen there. He gives up a knight, but he's going for checkmate. He's just going all in. But thankfully, I just about have enough. If the knight wasn't here, this position could be tricky because he's threatening checkmate right now. But I have knight h4, which simultaneously attacks the queen and defends the bishop. He plays queen g5, and now I can grab the rook that was hanging, and my opponent resigned. So it all kind of fell apart in a few moves, really. But it was a tough game. My opponent played well, but still on 100%, 18 out of 18. Game number 19. If you're still with me, thank you. I know it's been a long journey, but I appreciate it. I hope you're enjoying it, or I hope you're learning something. And so please like and subscribe if you are. So my opponent, Big Max Sauce Jr., who's now rated 1600, but at the time was I think about 1200. So he's improved since then clearly. He starts with c4, knight f6, and we go into a King's Indian, but he started with c4, so it's actually an Anglo-Indian. All opening book. So I played knight g4, which is a bit unusual in the King's Indian. Usually playing like knight e8 and then f5, but this is opening theory. It's still very equal as you can see from the eval bar. I play f6, which is fine in this case, thankfully. And then I rotate my knight back to h6. So that knight's been to f6, g4, and now h6, and we'll probably go to f7 quite soon. And there we go. So it's danced around 3 times and it's just moved 1 square from f6 to f7, but it's fine. And now my opponent, because in the King's Indian or in the Anglo-Indian in this case, it's quite common for white to push the pawns on the queen side, and black, sorry, will attack on the king side with f5, maybe g5, f4, and so on. So this is the start of that, or it looks to be anyway, after b4. Bishop e6, trying to get that knight out of d5 because it's a complete pain in the ass, to be honest. My opponent just keeps pushing on the queen side, b5. I play a little in-between move, taking the knight. If he were to take my knight on c6 with the pawn, my bishop could come back and I would win a pawn. I was hoping for that, but it was a forlorn hope. And then knight e7. So my position is a little bit passive right now. -1 to me, but it's not particularly clear. Actually, it's not -1 to me. I was lying. But yeah, it's not that clear. But yeah, I feel like this at this point the b5 pawn it looks more like a bit of a weakness, or it could be. So my plan was just try and go for that really, if I can. He plays a4 to defend it, and I play a6 to destabilize that connection there. Drive his bishop out of the way because that was just driving me nuts for a while. That pin on f6, and now I get my knight into g6. Um, and now this f4 square here is looking pretty juicy for me. Even though it's actually plus 1.3 to white, I didn't know that at the time, thankfully. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been quite so happy. But yeah, I feel like there's still plenty of chances for me. He plays h4, so he's going to attack on the king side and the queen side because he's realized that the queen side isn't really breaking through. Um, Apparently, the best move there instead of h4 would have been to swap the pawns on a6 and then play d4. I didn't see that at the time, going to be honest, but breaking through on d4 would make sense. It would destabilize me a little bit on e5, but thankfully he didn't do that. So he swapped the pawns and swapped the knights, which I was pretty happy with. Engine not so much, but I was, because I was thinking potentially about playing king h8 and rook g8 and get this little battery going here, which is also an idea in King's Indian sort of positions. But we're a bit of a way off from that right now. Also, bishop h6 looks pretty nice as well, getting rid of this queen. I played queen d7, going for this pawn, and my opponent played bishop g3. I'm not sure what happened there. If he didn't see that I was attacking the pawn on b5, or maybe he was coming up with some ideas I didn't even see. But anyway, I took the pawn and I won the pawn. Uh, it's not exactly a one pawn because he can play rook b1, and then I can play queen a6, and then we can dance around for a bit. But I thought I could probably hold on to the pawn. But he didn't really try and win this pawn on b7 anyway. He played d4. Uh, a little bit later than he should have done. He probably should have done it a bit earlier, according to the engine. But my queen's attacked by the bishop, so I go back, and then we exchange pawns, and we get to the following position where I'm a pawn up, um, which has been quite a common theme today. I think that I'm just a pawn up and then trying to kind of push that advantage on. Except here it's not quite clear how I'm going to do that, apart from maybe this b pawn being a pass pawn. That was my plan, or as we said, the king h8, rook g8 sort of idea. So my opponent, he keeps pushing. He keeps going for it. I respect that. He never gave up. f4, bishop takes f4. Um, so now my king, he hasn't got many pawns around him at the moment, but thankfully he has the bishop, knight, and rook just kind of all around him like a big Tetris square there or something. I swap the rooks, and then f5, attacking the rook on a1 uh, with discovered attack. He plays rook a7, so I grab the pawn on e4, and he grabs the pawn on b7. Now we reach this position on move 29, where it's incredibly open um, position, where both kings have not great protection, certainly pawns-wise around them, but there's still plenty of minor and major pieces around. So there's danger everywhere, and it feels like anybody can win. I have turned the screw now. I am winning, but with those two bishops that he's got, I feel like anything could still happen. So I played knight d6, attacking his rook, and he goes backwards. I played queen f7, going for his bishop on f4. He goes back, and now this is a bit of a pain because his bishops are guarding everything that I want to do. So I played knight f5, trying to get rid of one of them, or knight g3. And now my opponent plays bishop c4, setting up potentially a skewer here. Not right now, because if he plays d6, then if he plays d6, I'm just gonna take his bishop. But it could happen at some point, so I have to be careful. Rook a8, which was the best move, finally. Uh, Finding the open file and getting that rook into the game a bit more. He goes back to stop me going to check him on a1. and now bishop e5 as well. So finally, I came up with the right ideas to actually win this game, get the rook on the open file and put the bishop in the middle, controlling all of the main squares, including a1 and h2, which will be very important very soon. Rook f1, pinning my knight, move out of the pin, and now he plays d6 check, which I knew was coming, but thankfully it doesn't really matter too much right now because I'm threatening queen h2, and yeah, I can just move my king out of the way. It doesn't really matter. No, even when his pawn gets to d7, it still doesn't matter because I have mate in 3 here. Did I see it? No, I did not. So I'll give you a second here if you wanna find the checkmate in 3 moves. So um, it would be bishop h2, which I did see, but and he has to play king f2 realistically. And there's the next part I didn't see, which was bishop g3, and I forgot that he couldn't go to e2. So he goes back to g1 and then queen h2 checkmate. I should have seen that really. I'm disappointed in myself. But anyway, I played queen h2 instead. It's still -7 for me, so not a disaster, but it's extended things and he's still got a lot of pieces on the board and my king's quite open, so I'm just, creating trouble for myself I didn't need to. King f2, bishop g3, king e2, and then I played queen h5 because weirdly it's the only move that wins. It looks obvious to just take the pawn here with check, but I would actually lose because of rook f2, and then I want to play just bishop takes rook, and I'm up 7 points of material, but he can queen, and I'm gonna lose. So I can't do that. So I'd actually just have to give up my queen for the rook, and then yeah, I'm not gonna win that. So thankfully, I found the only winning move, which is queen h5. It's winning because his king is so blocked in that the only thing he can do is put the rook in the way, and thankfully I can take it with check. Um, yeah, this was a very topsy-turvy sort of game. Well, thankfully it wasn't too topsy-turvy, but it could have been. Um, so yeah, I'm -10 up, but I could easily be losing this in a second as well, considering my king is so open. If he gets his bishop onto c3, it's checkmate, or if he gets the queen on c3, it's checkmate. So it could go badly wrong. Queen h2 now, and I get the queens off. This helps a lot because I know it's gone back to -4. It wasn't the cleanest way of doing it, but I felt much more comfortable with this. And now h5. I've given my king some breathing room on h7. There's no longer checkmate on c3 anymore, so I was quite happy with this. I felt like I'm finally out of the woods. I'm a rook up, and the danger's kind of gone, despite the pawn being on d7. I feel like I'm coming out of the woods now. He defends the pawn and attacks my knight. I attack his bishop. He pins my knight, which is a bit of a pain. Those two bishops are kind of killing me, but thankfully I have the rook as well. I move the bishop back to h4 to stop his bishop coming to f6, which would be setting up queening. So I got there in the nick of time. He plays f4, and now I move out of the way of the pin, and now I take the bishop off the board, and he resigns because it would continue with taking the knight presumably, and then I can just maybe just pitch my knight the bishop on e7, and he can't do anything. He just can move his king and bishop around, but I'm just gonna either push this one or this one, and it's gonna be game over. So let's have a look at the second game with Big Mac Sauce Jr. From the States. So I was white in this one. I started with e4. And we had a Pietz defense. Not too common. I don't really like playing against it. Don't really know how to play against it. But let's see what happens. As a general rule, I feel like in against the Pietz, you want to develop everything in the center because your opponent is playing quite passively with like one pawn push, maybe one pawn push. So just take the center basically and develop as fast as you can, which is what I try to do. This is the quiet system of the pits. I mean, it seems very quiet anyway. This is the quiet system of the quiet opening. I just castle, just do all the normal sort of things. He plays knight d7 because he wants to play c5 or e5, and I get rid of his bishop. So I have the bishop pair. It's plus zero point 0.7 to me, roughly, but it's all pretty dull so far. I don't know who's winning really. Now he plays e5. Finally, he gets that pawn break he was looking for, and I played bishop e3. Apparently not the right move. Apparently um, I should have played d5 and and then potentially bishop g5, bishop h4, queen e2. I don't know. I didn't really want to block things any further because I was a bit bored, to be completely honest. So I played bishop e3, hoping that he would take the pawn. He didn't do that. We get our rooks involved, and then he does take the pawn, and I get my bishop onto d4, which I was pretty happy about because he could play c5 and attack it, but then his pawn on d6 is going to be a backward pawn, like we saw in the game against the Irish guy at the start. So, I'm perfectly fine with that. To be completely honest, though, I forgot he could play knight e5, which is a bit of a pain. I don't really want to give up my bishop on f3, so I have to go back to e2. It looks a bit ugly, and it stops his knight coming to c4 as well, which is important. Now c5 comes, but he's still going to have that backward pawn on d6, but his knights are quite active now. But I was quite happy when he played c5. Now a6, he clearly wants b5 and a queenside push. I put my rook behind the queen. That d6 pawn is looking more vulnerable by the second. He defends it with the bishop, and now f4. So my opponent wants to push on the queen side. I'm pushing on the king side. He gets his knight out of the way. Bishop f3. Slowly, the bishop pair is becoming a bit more active. Queen c7. I presume to try and get his rook on d8 to defend the pawn. I played a3. I think it was just to stop the knight coming to b4. I can't quite remember. And now he moves the queen again to b6, attacking the pawn on b2. Fine. And I played b4 because there's a pin here. He can't take the pawn on b4, so that's fine. And now he plays a5, which I think was a mistake. It looks perfectly reasonable because if I absentmindedly just take that pawn, now this b file is open and this a pawn is absolutely horrendous. But I didn't do that. So instead, what did I play? I played knight d5, attacking the queen and the knight at the same time. Apparently, it wasn't the right move though. It looked obvious to put your knight on d5. It just looks like a beautiful square, but apparently I was meant to take the pawn, swap the pawns, e5. Knight's got to go back to d7. No, according to the engine, rook e d8 in between. Okay, fair enough. I'm going to move my queen to f2, and knight's going to go back to e8. I guess the engine does like these sort of positional takeover things, but as a human, I find it very hard to kind of work out those positional big advantages. So my opponent doesn't swap the knights. He goes back to d8, which was, I think, a mistake. Now the pawns get swapped, and I play queen c3. So now this pawn is double attacked, and this knight is double attacked. So swap the knights, which is fine for me because now his queen's attacked and the pawn's attacked for a third time. He tries to play the danger levels, bishop g7, which is fine, but I still win the pawn, so it doesn't really matter. He plays queen e7. He wants to swap queens. I'm not too against that, given that I'm a pawn up, but at the same time, I thought I'll just double the rooks because I'll just take over the d file whilst I have it. He doesn't actually swap the queens, so I do it, and it turns out that the rook e d1 was actually d8, rook a d8, excuse me, was a blunder because no matter what he plays now, if he takes the queen back, boom, boom, and boom, and he's lost a piece. Or alternatively, if he takes my rook, I can take his other rook with check, and then the other rook is gone. And yeah, so he lost a piece basically, and he resigned. So 20 out of 20. If you're still here, thank you so much. Two more games to go, uh, and I'm going to play the best opponent in my group. Let's see what happens. So the final two games. At this point, me and my opponent, Tiger 1888, with a lovely picture of Mikhail as his profile picture. Both had 20 out of 20, so it's winner takes all situation. So the pressure's on, and my opponent at the time I think was rated about 11 something, maybe 1200. So I need to win this basically. Draw's not enough. So we'll have a look at the white game first. So I played e4, best by test, and we start with a Sicilian, open Sicilian as usual for me, and it's typical theory. I don't know how many times I've played this, probably thousands of times in Blitz and Rapid online. My opponent plays the g6, which I think is the Sozin attack, and Efi Kittos, the bishop and castles. And I wasn't sure whether to go king or queen side, but I went queen side. I'll try and imbalance the game. I want to win if I can. My opponent plays knight e5, which is probably the biggest weakness of this setup for white, because this e5 square is for the taking for black, unless I play f4 at some point, but that's not going to happen right now, realistically. I move the bishop back out of the way, a6, and now g4 comes. It's like this sort of English attack, um, in this dragon setup that it's now turned into, according to Stockfish. Rook c8. So my opponent's going to use the c file to attack my king, and I'm just going to keep pushing these pawns, and whoever gets there first with their attack is going to win. So I put h4, and he plays h5, which is the right idea really. You want to stop that h pawn in its tracks. I put king b1. As I said earlier, when you castle queenside, you're often going to do that. Apparently, it was a mistake. I think what was I meant to do? Let's have a look. I think I was meant to take the pawn and then play bishop h6, which is fair enough. I just wasn't really sure how I'm gonna get through, really. But obviously the engine finds, swapping the bishops off, pushing the f pawn up. You know, I trust him. I trust him. He's pretty strong, the engine. King b1. He plays b5. And now I do take the pawn. And he takes back. I played rook dg1, and as you can see from the little symbols on the screen, my opponent timed out. Um, which is always a bit of a little bit disappointing way to win, but at the same time, it happens quite a lot in round one, and now I've moved on to 21 out of 21, and my opponent needs to win to get through. So let's see what happens. Let's look at the final game. So I've saved possibly the best game for last, or definitely the most difficult to win, that's for sure. So my opponent plays d4, and we start. I played e6 again. As I said earlier, I quite like to play that. And we get a standard Queen's Gambit decline setup. Bishop g5, though, in this situation, which is apparently called the modern variation. We're using opening book here, I'm pretty sure. A lot of standard opening moves. My opponent takes the knight on f6, which I'm not too disappointed about. In most positions, I'm pretty happy if my opponent gives up the bishop for the knight there. And then I utilize this kind of like winning a tempo, basically, because my opponent plays bishop e2, which makes perfect sense because he wants the castle. But now I'm going to grab that pawn on c4 that's been a little bit of tension there between them for a while, and now he has to move the bishop again to grab it. So he's moved the bishop twice. So I've won a little tempo. So that's why the eval has gone slightly in my favor. Just a small little thing, but it can make a difference, that one move later on. So I played c5, which it looks more like a sort of Grunfeld idea where this bishop is on this diagonal and you play c5 and you hope to kind of maybe like queen a5 and attack the knight, maybe the rook. Generally, I quite like that sort of position for black. And my opponent castles, and now we swap the pawns off, and now he's got his knight in the center. So, pretty equal. My opponent's definitely developed better than I have. My whole queen side is just sitting in their original positions right now. But, I'm not too disappointed. This bishop's doing pretty well, and the queen has a lot of scope for movement, which I make use of immediately with queen b6. He moves his knight back to b3. I attack his bishop, he moves it back, and I don't quite win a pawn there. But I did at least force my opponent to have two separate pawn islands, which might be important later on. I think that's why it's minus zero point 0.7 to me, because of these pawn islands. Everything else is equal, and he's developed better than I have with his minor pieces, but these pawns are weak. So if I can get the rook maybe here, or if I can somehow get this open file, I can maybe grab one of these pawns, and that's how I'm going to try and win. So I suddenly start developing bishop d7. He plays a4 because he realized, as well as developing bishop d7, will set up for bishop a4. So he's stopping that by planting his pawn right in the middle of the way. I play rook d8, going to set up a nice discovered attack on the queen, which he sees. He moves it out of the way. So knight a6. Now finally, almost all of my pieces apart from that rook on a8 are developed. He attacks my queen. I move it out of the way. Then he attacks my queen again. So I probably should have went to just c7 immediately, but okay, so now I do. So I lost that move back there probably, but I'm still slightly ahead according to the engine. But how am I going to win? It's tricky. Rook c8 is the obvious option going for this pawn, that backward pawn, which has been a bit of a theme today for some reason. Queen b2. I played e5 because this light squared bishop has just been stuck here for so long on these two squares, and now it's finally got some room to move somewhere. And the other idea of it was that my opponent clearly wanted knight d4 at some stage, so I'm just going to stop that in its tracks. Rook d1, bishop c6. I'm quite happy to trade those bishops because my bishop is just a bit crap, really. And my opponent doesn't swap them because he realizes his bishop is better than mine. I swap rooks, and then I get my rook behind the queen that I mentioned a few moves ago was going to happen, going for that c3 pawn, and also this a5 pawn is also still hanging if the knight moves at some point. So he takes my knight, which is a bit annoying. He's doubled my pawns there, but at the same time, they're not going to be attacked. Like, how is my opponent going to get to them? Really, he can play knight c5, but then I can grab that pawn. So there's no real threat to them. They're doubled, but they're not weak right now. So minus 1.1. Things are improving slowly, but we're not even halfway through the game yet. Queen a3. I put my bishop on b5, which is, I think, the right square for the bishop because it's defended nicely there. And it's kind of like the outpost square for the bishop with the pawn defending it. And we dance around a little bit. He attacks my queen. I move it around. He moves his knight again, attacking my pawn at e5, and I defend it. When you push this f6 forward, these light squares become really weak. But I'm the one that has a light squared bishop, so it doesn't matter. Not too much anyway. His knight is going to struggle to get in there. He plays h3 just to give his king some breathing space for the back rank mate. I play rook c4, the idea of which was to come rook a4 and then get this pawn. My opponent once again saw that he played very well in both games actually, even the one he timed out. He's seen most things that I'm trying to do. He's not making it easy for me whatsoever. I move my king out of the pin. Um, he played king h2. I get the feeling maybe on this position he wasn't really sure what to play because I don't know what king h2 was supposed to do apart from maybe stopping a check later. But um, and then I wasn't really sure myself here what to do, but it seemed obvious that I can go for that pawn. And how does he defend it? And he doesn't actually defend it at all. I thought he would play rook a1 here, but instead he plays rook d1 to attack my queen. Maybe he didn't see it. I'm not sure. But anyway, he played rook d1, and now I've got that pawn. So my principal objective in all of these games to get a pawn up and try and win has happened. And I'm also double attacking the c3 pawn. So if I win that pawn and go 2 pawns up, this could be game over. So my opponent stops that. I move the queen out of the way to allow my a pawn to run. I move my rook out of the way, and then it's going to get a bit annoying for a little bit with c4. So I move my bishop back to e8, which, as it turns out, wasn't really the right move because he plays rook b1, and he's threatening queen b8, and then potentially winning that bishop. So I probably should have went to d7 instead, but it's small margins, I guess. So I moved the bishop to c6. I wasn't really sure what to play, but I thought if I just stop the queen coming here, then I'm okay with that. I really thought my opponent would just play queen b8, swap the queens off, and just try and defend this position because I wasn't sure if it was winnable. And according to Stockfish, actually probably wasn't. It's equal. But my opponent didn't go with that. He just moved the king back to g1 because he clearly didn't fancy it. So I was happy with that, and I just started to push the a pawn, both a pawns actually, threatening rook b4 right now, which is why he moves the rook out of the way. And I just, slowly just kind of set up a nicer position for myself. Like the b file is now mine, even though 2 moves ago he owned it, and now I completely own it. Now I push the a pawn forward again. Now the other a pawn comes forward. So they're both on a6 and a7. Now they're on a4 and a5. So we're getting there slowly. I moved the queen back to c8. I can't remember why I did that now, actually, but I'm still winning. I don't know. I can't remember. Queen d3. And I moved my rook back because I realized that I wasn't sure how else to make progress because I can't play rook b3. I can't play a3. So my new plan was rook b7, rook d7, and try and infiltrate this way instead, which is why he plays queen c3. And I take over the d file instead because I thought this was maybe more important. I'll try and infiltrate here and then get this pawn, which is why he plays knight f1 to defend that pawn. And I do still infiltrate, and now I get that pawn forward, another square a3. And he played, I think e4 was probably the critical mistake here. I mean, he was already in a worse position, but e4, I don't know. I don't think it was a great idea to give me that d4 square personally. Rook c3 is the obvious threat now, which ends up happening. I don't get the pawn because his knight is annoyingly stuck there on d2, but I get to push my a4 pawn forward now. So the march of the double pawns is still happening. Queen b4, which is kind of threatening queen f8, but it doesn't actually do anything. Looks a little bit scary, but there's no malice to it. And at this point, I finally set up the winning idea because after kind of always going with this slowly approach of a pawns forward, trying to grab this pawn, I realized that the actual way to win the game is over here on the king side. So I played rook c1, threatening queen g1. And he takes the pawn, so now it's equal material, but it doesn't matter because it's not about the queen side anymore. It's all on the king side. Queen g1, king g3, queen e1, and we could repeat moves. In fact, we do. But I realized after a lot of thought of earlier not knowing how to win the game that the best idea is actually h5, h4, queen g3, and it's very difficult to stop. He can throw a few checks in, but he can't actually stop it. So h5, knight b3 attacks the rook, but it also loses a knight. He plays queen f8, and he actually resigns before I even had to make the move because he realized. Well, I'm sure he didn't realize it was minus 20 on Stockfish, but let's see what would happen. King h7, and then whatever he plays, according to the engine, rook a7 is the best move, but it's still mate in 11. Queen g1, king g3, and then I can grab the rook and basically the threat is h4 and then queen check, and it's going to be checkmate, and there's no way of stopping it. So, in case you're wondering how it all finished, as we can see, the bottom six opponents there didn't really play, so they didn't end up with many points. Naifome from Ireland slash Sweden finished on 12, Alan Williams on 15, Sans on 16, Big Mac Sauce Jr. on 17, and my friend from India, or Mikhail on 20, and I finished on 22 out of 22 for the second year in a row. Last year I made it to round three. Hopefully I can go one better this year, or at least make it to the same stage. I'll be very happy with that. So very, very long video today. I'm sorry about that. If you watched the whole thing, or even if you just watched little bits, or just the best games like this one, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. If you liked what you saw, or if you want to see more from me or my friend Shane from the Bishop Pair, then please consider giving us a like and subscribe. That would be amazing. Or give any comments if you have any feedback for today's video. And if you're still playing in the Daily Chess Championships in round two, hopefully see you there. If not, good luck. And if you're already out of the tournament, well done for playing. Hope you had fun, and hopefully play again next year. Um, and yeah, thank you so much for watching today's video, and I'll see you next time.